We're so excited to welcome you to our webinar of Claude Goldenberg. I'm Sarah Rich, and I'm the founder and CEO of Just Right Reader. And Claude, I like to say that I am living my best life. I was a principal for over 20 years and then tons of turnaround schools. And a whole vision that I tried to create when I was a principal was about like just learning and loving the research out there and we talk to these researchers like Claude all the time. And we felt that researchers like Claude should not just talk to us, but talk to all of you. So we're really excited to be here today and welcome Claude Goldenberg to talk about English language learners and the research behind supporting them in reading. And I hope that everyone who's here will put your name, put your area, put your title in the chat. And not only will we get to have a wonderful conversation with Claude, but we'll also have a wonderful conversation in the chat amongst all of you. So please jump in, say your name, your district, your area, and what you do for the district. And Claude, I am so excited. Your we're going to learn so much to support English language learners. It's a big belief and passion of ours to keep doing that.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
All right, I'll let you just jump in and then I'll jump on at the end.
Okay, very good. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning for me. I'm in California, and if it's afternoon for you, good afternoon. And if you're somewhere across the Pacific, very good morning. I'm delighted to be here with you. I just want to let you know that in the chat, or let's see, I think it's in the chat, there's some handouts that you're welcome to download whenever you want. The slide deck, my PowerPoint deck is available there, so please don't feel like you've got to scribble down everything or anything that you find interesting or useful. All the references are there. Everything's there. Then there are a couple of articles on there that I'll mention to you, but I just wanted to alert you to the fact that they're there. So as Sarah mentioned, one of the things that I've been interested in, particularly since I retired from Stanford a few years ago, and I've always been interested in English learners and education and literacy, of course. It's been a topic and a concern of mine for, I'm not going to tell you how long. But one of my concerns has been that there's a lot, people talk about the importance of research. And certainly as a researcher, I believe in the importance of research. But very often, they're very selective in what research to cite. And I think while we all agree in the abstract that research must guide how we teach English learners to read, I don't imagine anyone would oppose that in principle. What I want to do is talk about some very specific research that I think is not well understood or well shared by the community of professionals, the teachers, administrators, curriculum developers, curriculum implementers, a lot of my colleagues and former colleagues in higher education. It's a difficult space for sure. So I don't want to kind of diminish the importance and the challenges of the complexity. But if we really believe that research must guide how we teach English learners to read, then we have to take a more expansive and precise view of some research that we may be giving short shrift to. So with that as prelude, let me start off with two inaccuracies about reading and English learners that I want to right off the bat challenge, and you'll see how it sort of they sort of flow through the presentation. So one inaccuracy is that the so-called science of reading is based on research with monolingual and English speakers. Well, it is based on research with monolingual and English speakers, but not only with monolinguals and English speakers. There is research, reading research, and just by the way, a little side note here, sometimes the term science of reading kind of gives me the willies because it's become sort of a buzzword. It's become like a lightning rod. And while there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the term science of reading, it immediately sort of draws a line in the sand and people line up on this side or that side. So I'm going to really refer to reading research more generally because it's a more neutral term that I think more fully encapsulates what we're talking about. And I'll talk about some very specific things, but I'm going to typically refer to it as reading research more generally. Anyway, this notion that science of reading is based on research only with monolinguals and English speakers is really untrue. And I'm going to show that to you in the course of the demonstration, my presentation. The other thing that is really an inaccuracy is that there's something called a bilingual brain that requires a fundamentally different approach to teaching reading. Now, I want to be careful and nuanced here because in a sense, there is something like a bilingual brain, and I'll use myself as an example. I'm bilingual, I have a brain, presumably, and so there's a bilingual brain clanging around in my head. But the question is, does this bilingual brain require a different approach to teaching reading? We have lots of evidence about the advantages of bilingualism, and I'll talk about bilingual education in a few minutes. But we want to be very careful when we say the bilingual brain requires fundamentally different approach to teaching reading specifically. And there's a lot of sort of mythology and inaccuracy around that, and I hope to get into that more specifically. Now, for those of you who want to follow up and maybe get into a few more details, there are two I guess sort of blogs, online articles that I published about the bilingual brain and reading research. There are two versions of what are essentially the same article, but they're pitched a little bit differently because they're on somewhat different platforms. This one that I have on the screen now, and the link is right below it. And again, it's on the PowerPoint, so please don't feel if you want to read it, well, I hope you will, don't have to scribble down the URL. This appeared in an online publication called Colorín Colorado, which is aimed at bilingual students, bilingual English learner, bilingual parents, teachers, educators, anyone who cares about the education of what we call English learners, emergent bilinguals, multilingual learners. The terms are used, they have slightly different meanings, but they're used interchangeably. I'm happy to use whichever one you prefer. So this particular article appeared there, but it also appeared with the same title as my presentation today, Research Must Guide How We Teach English Learners, and that appeared in a California-centric publication called EdSource. And as I say, the content of both is very similar, but they're pitched a little bit differently because they're on different platforms that have different audiences. So if you want to go into more detail on what I'll be talking about today, then I would encourage you to go to these, and they're also in the handout, so you can just download those very easily. Okay, so let's get into some content here, and I want you to think about, there are 51 states and DC, and we want to think about the population of English learners, right? They're national. There are English learners in every state in the country, and in many, if not most, jurisdictions. And what I'd like you to do is to write in the chat, which state do you think is the highest in percent ELs in their school population? So if you wouldn't mind, put that, just give it a thought, put it in the chat. Chat. I see Texas, I see California, Texas, California, neck and neck. California, any others? South Carolina, definitely some there. I was there not too long ago. Florida, good one. Sunny South Florida, right. California, Texas. All right, California and Texas seem to be kind of high on the list. All right. Okay, now, which one do you think is lowest in percent ELs in their school population? I bet we have more diversity there. Harder question, isn't it? Wyoming. Coincidentally, I was just there. Montana, Idaho, Vermont, Nebraska. Yeah, all over the map, isn't it? Wisconsin? Maybe not. Michigan, Kansas, Maine. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a that's a much tougher question, isn't it? And then I want you don't have to put this in the chat, um, but we'll answer it in a few minutes. But I want you to think about what's the percentage in your state, and where do you think your state falls in this continuum? So here's a really interesting graph that I found. Um, and the URL for it is down here in case you want to find it when you download. And this is the range across all 50 states and DC. And you can see the average United States is 10.3. And then, as some of you surmised, Texas is number one. 20% of the public school population is ELs. But if you put California, you get the silver medal because California is in second place. And then on the other end is West Virginia. West Virginia is number 51. They're less than these four states here, and Wyoming is one of them, have fewer than 3%. Right? So you see they break down these states have fewer than 3%. These states have between 3 and 6%. The key is over here. I'm not just making this up. These states here, which are, I think, the most states are between 6 and 10%. And then there are those who are more than 10%. So here's some specifics. Wisconsin is 36th. So if you guess Wisconsin, you weren't that far off. Colorado's 11th. Florida's 15th. That might surprise you. And New Jersey is 30th. Now, one of the things that's hidden here is that the EL population is pretty diverse. I mean, we know that, say, 80% of the students are from Hispanic, Latino, Spanish-speaking backgrounds, but even there's some diversity. A lot of those from Mexico, but there are also some from Central America and a few from South America. Like, 60, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but let's just say 65 years ago, I would have been a Spanish-speaking EL from Argentina because that's where I was from. So that even within the Spanish-speaking EL population, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. And then if you speak about the whole EL population, it's more diverse. I mean, I probably don't need to tell you that Florida is heavily Cuban and Caribbean. New Jersey has more Puerto Rican students. A lot of these states, Colorado, Wisconsin, Wyoming, has, particularly now with a lot of the refugees and asylum seekers, sadly, from Afghanistan and Ukraine, the population becoming even more diverse. And it varies a lot depending on what state you happen to be in, as I'm sure you realize. Then if you want to find the percent of your particular state, which is much harder to do on this graph, you probably know where your state is in the country, and you can locate the percentage. And this is as of fall 2020. So it's pretty recent. There might be some changes now, particularly because of the influx of refugees, but I think it's still probably pretty accurate. So you can find where all the states are. And again, these ones with the white are less than 3%. And then you can see there's a concentration here and less so in these, and then around the south and up through the Ohio River Valley into Pennsylvania. There are fewer, but still some. There's not a state that doesn't have a detectable percentage, at least 2 or 3% of students who are English learners. So it's an issue of national concern. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about it. The issues and the challenges vary depending on the nature of the population, the influx, the resources that states have, but it's a challenge and an opportunity. I mean, I want to emphasize the fact that the presence of so many children and families who speak another language, we tend to think about that as some kind of handicap or some kind of burden or some kind of challenge to overcome. And certainly there are challenges for the students, for the teachers, but there are opportunities there. There are opportunities to sort of enrich the linguistic fabric of the country. And I'll talk about that just a little bit more when I get to some comments on bilingual education. Okay, so let's talk about reading. And you don't have to answer anything in the chat if you don't want to, but I want you to think about reading just in general, right? And is teaching reading, is it rocket science? You're probably familiar with this very, very important and well-known document by Louisa Moats, over 20 years old, which talked about teaching reading is rocket science. I mean, that's become a pretty popular phrase. But there's another perspective, And this is one by the late, great Phyllis Hunter, who is much less known, but I think no less important a thinker with respect to literacy, reading education, particularly for diverse populations, for students where there's an opportunity and an achievement gap. That's what Phyllis devoted her life to. And her perspective in this book, that again is less well known, but I think, really worth contemplating. And she says it's really not that complicated. So just think about it. Is teaching reading rocket science, or is it not that complicated? Now, there's no definitive scientific answer to this, but just think about it in general, just to kind of contextualize us. Okay? So now I'd like you to think about this. Many students around the world learn to read and write in a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. Now, these are called English learners in the United States. I was in Australia a few months ago, and those students there are called, let's see, I think it's EALs, English as an additional language. So what we call ELs, they call EALs. But they're talking about the same phenomenon. A student who has to learn to read and to write in a language they are simultaneously learning to speak and understand, right? That's what we're talking about. So the question here is teaching reading to these students, is that rocket science or not that complicated? Or is it closer to one or to the other? And here, I would like you to think about it and write in the chat, an answer in the chat. Is teaching reading to students who are simultaneously learning the language not rocket science, not that complicated, or is it closer to one or the other? And if you're not sure, if you don't know, those are acceptable answers. So please answer those in the chat. I think I hear a lot of good thinking because I'm not seeing any chatting. Okay, closer to rocket science, closer to rocket science. Not sure. Rocket science. Oh, rocket science. Closer rocket science. Somewhere in the middle, kids learning English, extra sports, we know. Teach kids how to read. Okay. Closer rocket science. Trying to practice my wait time. Closer rocket science, rocket science. Definitely a science, but not rocket science. Okay. I think it's clear on what side of this continuum, closer to not that complicated. Oh, okay, that's a different one because we know practice help ELs learn like modeling requires good teaching and learn. Okay. Charlie has a different take. I'm not sure which. It's a great question. It is awesome to see learning in action. Well, that's good. Feels like rocket science, but I'm not. Okay, great. Okay, very good. So, and now this. Think about this. If you're learning to read in a language, you are simultaneously learning to speak and understand. Okay, so now I'm putting you in that position. Is it basically similar to or different from learning to read in a language you already know? Okay, we're talking about the same idea here. You're learning to read in a language you are simultaneously learning to speak and understand. Is that basically similar to or different from learning to read in a language you already know? And here's what I'd like you to answer in the chat. Which is true? Learning to read in a language you are simultaneously learning is basically the same as learning to read in a language you already know. That's an A. Please, you don't have to write all that. Just put an A if that's what you believe. Or B, learning to read in a language you are simultaneously learning is basically different from learning to read in a language you already know. Or C, no clue, you tell me. Okay, perfectly acceptable response. So please put A, B, or C in the chat. A, 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 letter A, C, B, A. Okay, B. Oh, B is catching up. Another B. Any others? I think some people are abstaining. Oh no, maybe everyone's voted. I don't know how people are out here, so I'm just sort of guessing. Okay, B, another B. Okay, it seems like it's a bit of a tie. A was winning, then B was catching up. There are a couple of C's. A, okay, all right, all right, all right. Okay, so here's the answer. Learning to read in a language you're simultaneously learning is basically the same as learning to read in a language you already know. But fear not, if you have no clue, you tell me, you still get credit for that. In fact, you get credit if you answered any of these. But this is the correct answer, letter A. And that whether it's rocket science or not, and I'm not going to resolve that because I don't think there's any definitive answer. Whether it's rocket science or not, learning to read in a language you're learning to speak and understand is complicated. I mean, I think we can agree on it being complicated. There's more involved, obviously. And therefore, so is the teaching. But here's some good news, and that is that it's basically similar to learning to read in a language you already know. But there's a qualifier. I told you it's complicated. Similar is not the same as identical. So this is the basic argument that I'm going to present to you today, and that I'll try to demonstrate or show and share with you some research on English learners and non-English learners that I hope will corroborate my position. And I'll try to answer the question, what's reading research? Notice I'm using reading research. That's my preferred term. What's reading research got to do with English learners? So my contention is that learning to read in a language you're simultaneously learning is basically similar to learning to read in a language you already know, but then similar is not the same as identical. So in order to answer this question, or to make my case, I should say, I want to raise three questions. What do we know from reading research about how children learn to read when they know the reading language? Then how is learning to read similar or different for children learning to read as they're learning the language? And then finally, the $64,000 question, right? The money question, so to speak. How does the teaching need to be similar or different when students are learning to read in a language they are simultaneously learning, right? That's what we will get to by the end of this talk. So let me pause again a second or two, and I want to say a word or two about bilingual education. As I'm sure all of you know, this is the single most controversial issue in the education of English learners, and it has been for over half a century, since the 1960s, when bilingual education became really part of the civil rights movement, national liberation movement, that African Americans, Chicano Americans, Asian Americans, people who felt that they'd been left out of the American dream were clamoring, and obviously rightly so, for their rights. And bilingual education was seen by a lot of Latino, Hispanic, Chicano educators as being one of the ways to accomplish educational equity. So it's been the single most controversial issue. And there's been a fair amount of research, not all of it, very convincing, but there's been a lot of research and it's very controversial. And just to make my position clear, I think that bilingual education is desirable for many reasons, but the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of English learners don't have the benefit of bilingual education. And if anyone wants to talk about that, you can raise it in the chat, or if anyone wants to email me afterwards and discuss this, I'm more than happy to do so. I think we should have bilingual education for everyone, not just for English learners, but for English monolingual kids. I mean, we'd be better off as a country, as a society, as an economy, if we expanded our linguistic repertoire rather than constrained it, which I think is what a lot of English-only policies have done. But the reality on the ground is that most English learners must become literate in a language they are simultaneously learning to speak and understand. And so that's who I'm going to address my comments to. But please don't let anyone leave this presentation and assume that I value or I think that English-only instruction is the way to go with English learners or with anyone for that matter. It's just I'm dealing with the reality on the ground as I know, and I'm sure you know, it exists. Okay, so let's go back to our 3 questions. And by answering them, I hope to help you see why I say that reading research is relevant for all learners, including learners learning to read in a language they're simultaneously learning. So what's our first question? What do we know from reading research about how children learn to read when they know the reading language? So here's our friend the brain. Now, let me, full disclosure, I am not a neuroscientist. I wouldn't know my earlobe from my prefrontal lobe, except one's inside my head and the other one's outside. But whatever I know, the little that I know, I think I know based on neuroscience that I've read, at least that I can understand, and some neuroscientists I'm fortunate enough to know or have learned from. But that's the extent of it. And if I get anything wrong, please blame the neuroscientists. But what we know from neuroscience, and this comes from several articles in a journal, you can see the reference at the bottom of the page, the slide, Journal of Neurolinguistics. And again, the references are all in the PowerPoint. Enormously informative, but also kind of, tough reads technically. But what I've learned from these, and this is a direct quote from, I believe it's the introductory article, that learners who know the language rely on a large network of brain regions as they try to bind orthography. Bind is actually the technical term that they use, bind orthography, which is the spelling system of the language, to an already present knowledge of phonology, which is the sound system of the language, to semantics, which is the meaning carried by the language, right? You have to bind orthography, the spelling, the written representation, to an already present knowledge of phonology and semantics, right? Now, we are born with those areas ready to go, right? We can see and start making sense of what we see. We can hear and start making sense of what we hear. The semantics, when you speak to a child, they learn the language passively but gradually actively to use it. It's a natural acquisition process. They know that human speech, they intuitively know that human speech carries meaning. In other words, the semantics of the language. In fact, we know from studies of newborns and very, very young babies that human speech is the stimulus that they respond to most readily. They will orient to human speech much more so, excuse me, than other environmental stimuli or inputs. So these things exist at birth, but what does not exist is what's called the brain circuitry that enables literacy, the binding of orthography to phonology and semantics. That brain circuitry has got to be built up in the first few years or sometime during the life of an individual. And it's that brain circuitry that enables literacy. Without the construction of that circuitry, literacy simply cannot happen. And how is that circuitry built up? Through environmental inputs, most often in the form of instruction, but also other environmental inputs, such as having literacy materials around and being exposed and socialized to what literacy is and reading books and reading things and talking about them. But the most important kind of environmental input is information about how the sounds of the language are represented by letters. And those sounds, those letters can be combined to form words that have meaning. In order for an individual to have that understanding, that brain circuitry has got to be constructed. And that's how reading happens. So in beginning and early literacy in alphabetic writing systems, I mean, it's also true in non-alphabetic writing systems, such as Chinese or Japanese, but it's a little more nuanced there. And I don't really know that much about it other than what some researchers, primarily those in Europe, have done. So let's just focus on alphabetic writing systems, because most of the languages that have writing systems are alphabetic. So let's just focus on those. So in beginning and early literacy and alphabetic writing system, beginning and early literacy requires learning these things: the alphabetic principle, that letters represent speech sounds, that spoken words comprise individual sounds, the sound symbol system, which we know as phonics, is the most reliable way to read words. And this is true even in opaque orthographies. If you're familiar with the concept of opaque versus transparent orthographies, opaque orthographies or deep orthographies have complex systems of sound symbol associations. English, as you might know, is an opaque orthography, because you can represent a sound like F in about 3 or 4 different ways. And the letter C can sound at least 2 different ways, depending on the letter that follows it. And a lot of irregularities. The sound of oo or u can be represented 4 or 5 different ways. So that's an opaque orthography, in contrast to Spanish or Finnish, which is a much more transparent orthography, because there's not exactly 100% one-to-one correspondence, but a 98, 99% correspondence between the sound and the letter that represents it. So in Spanish, you have 5 vowels, a, e, I, o, u. Each one represents one and only one sound. In English, it's a lot more complicated. But whether the alphabetic orthography is opaque or transparent, the sound symbol system is the most reliable way to read the words. So you want to emphasize in the teaching and the learning word recognition by decoding, and then using context and word meaning secondary to confirm. And I'll get more into that, what exactly I mean, in a few minutes. And then you want to work toward fluency, always working towards fluency, so it becomes automatic. You don't have to think, you don't have to decode everything you see. You know the words by sight because you've seen them. You've made the sound, symbol, meaning connection with those words, and you build up a bank of sight words that you can read with great automaticity and fluency. So these are the foundations of learning to read: understanding the alphabetic principle, that spoken words comprise individual sounds, the sound symbol system, which we know as phonics, but it's actually more than phonics. That's kind of the sort of superficial term for it. And that recognizing words by decoding is what's essential, but then context and word meaning are used secondarily to confirm it. And always working toward automaticity and fluency. Now, let me back up a second. So these foundations are necessary. They're absolutely necessary. They're not sufficient. Lots of other things have to kick in for students to develop as proficient readers, such as language development, including, vocabulary, comprehension, background, general knowledge. But we know these comprise an essential foundation. So what needs to happen in the brain under the hood for literacy to be possible? Well, as I was saying before, the brain circuitry must be constructed that connects, binds the sounds of the language, phonology, to the spelling system, the orthography, and then to word meanings or semantics. If you're familiar with the term orthographic mapping that was coined by Linnea Airy, that is precisely what she is describing. Sound, symbol, meaning get bound together to form sight words. And as you grow your bank of sight words, literacy grows, and the opportunity for more and more and more expansive, deeper, and broader literacy becomes possible. These are foundational. But here's the thing. If all you have is a foundation, you haven't got much. And this is regardless of whether you're an EL or fully proficient in English. I mean, that's a nice foundation, but I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to live there. I prefer my houses to have, rooms, bathrooms and kitchens and stuff like that. But the foundation is still essential, because without a foundation, you can have this, or you can have sort of an interesting tourist attraction, but more often than not, you have something that's really not in anyone's best interests, quite fatal. So the foundation is still essential. So now let's turn to reading with English learners. And we turn to how students learning to read as they're learning the language, or saying it another way, students learning to read in the language, they are simultaneously learning to speak and understand. How is it similar or different from children, I'm sorry, how is it similar or different from how children learn to read as they're learning the language? Well, it turns out that learning to read in the language you're learning is basically the same as learning to read in the language you know, because they involve similar networks of brain activation. The same areas of the brain need to be used, need to be harnessed, need to be connected. I mean, choose your metaphor to create that brain circuitry between sound, symbol, and meaning. And similar networks of brain activation to do what? Well, to link print and speech, to support phonological awareness, letter sound mapping, learning phonics and decoding, and other foundational reading processes. Excuse me. And this is from the brain science. This is from the Journal of Neurolinguistics. And the conclusion here is that the foundations are identical, regardless of if you're learning to read in a language you know or a language you are learning. That letters represent speech sounds, that letters and sounds combine to represent comprehensible words and text, both spoken and written. Ah, there's the rub, comprehensible words and text. Because what's comprehensible is precisely where the differences exist between speakers who know the language, language learners, readers, learning readers, emergent readers who know the language, and emergent readers who don't know the language. What is comprehensible is where the differences lie. Because remember, learners who know the language rely on a large network of brain regions as they try to bind the orthography to an already present knowledge of phonology and semantics. Well, that already present knowledge is what is not there. That's why they're English learners. They're learning the phonology and the semantics. So learning to read in a language you already know and one you're learning are similar, but they're not exactly the same, because emergent bilinguals require additional supports that English proficient students typically do not need. And this is demonstrated in the neurolinguistic studies that have been done, that language learners require additional supporting brain regions during learning because they have no or limited, we have a range of English proficiencies among English learners. Some have very little, even no English, some intermediate amount, some have quite a bit. They're still English learners, so they may need less supporting brain regions, but they'll probably need some. They have limited or no already present knowledge of phonology and semantics. So here's what I want you to do. Think about it. This is a little bit of a check for understanding. You don't have to write it down because it would get a little tedious. But write down somewhere, you don't have to write it in the chat. What's the principal difference between teaching reading to someone who knows the language and to someone who is learning it? I'm just going to pause for a couple of minutes here, check with Sarah or Tracy how I'm doing on time, and I want you to jot down the answer to that. You can put it in the chat if you want to, but you don't need to, because I'm going to give you what I think is the answer and you can compare it. Sarah, Tracy, how am I doing on time?
You're perfect. Keep going. I think everyone's enjoying it.
Oh,
It's fabulous.
okay, good. Okay, so maybe actually, let's see, are there things, can you put up a thumbs up or something in your chat when you've had a chance to jot it down? Because I don't want to rush anyone, but I don't want to belabor it. So are there little symbols? I don't use this platform, so I don't know if they're like thumbs up or symbols or something, but you can put in the chat something like ready or yes or okay or something. Okay, ready. Okay, I'm gonna write another. 30 seconds. Good to go. Great, thank you. Okay, all right. So what's the principal difference between teaching reading to someone who knows a language and to someone who is learning it? Here's my answer from the research. Students who are learning the language as they're learning to read it need additional support to help them learn the meanings and the sounds of the words being used to teach them to read. Additional support to help them learn the meanings and the sounds of the words being used to teach them to read. Because remember, you're wanting them to connect the sounds of the language which they're learning to the written representation, the orthography, the reading part, which they're also learning, to the meaning of the words, which they're also learning. They're learning all three. And think about it, when you're teaching reading to a student who already knows the language, they know the sounds and the meanings, right? Think of the language proficiency of a typical 5, 6, 7-year-old. The words being used to teach them to read are typically familiar to them. Absent some developmental delay or some kind of anomaly, the words that we use to teach young children to read are words that they already know. So they can accomplish that binding by simply, and I use simply in quotation marks, by simply learning the sounds of the letters and the orthography and the spelling system, right? That's what they got to learn. They already know the phonology and they already know the meanings. But for the English learners, they got to learn all three. But the same thing has to happen. They have to create that brain circuitry that facilitates, that enables literacy. Okay. Now, here, I like the brain science, because it's so sciencey, and people think, oh, it's neurolinguistics, and so that's fine. I think the neurolinguistics is great, interesting, but I'll tell you, by itself, that doesn't really prove anything other than what needs to happen under the hood. The question is, what needs to happen outside under the hood in the classroom in order to facilitate that process? So what goes under the hood creates that brain circuitry. So I'm going to now turn to my favorite part of the presentation, titled, It's Not Just Brain Science. Because we know we have classroom intervention studies that support the same conclusions, that the foundation for learning to read is the same, whether you're learning to read in a language you are learning or one you already know. But they are not identical. Language learners require additional supports. And I got to tell you, it's really quite remarkable, the convergence between the neurolinguistic, the neuroscience, the pure basic neuroscience, and the classroom applications. The convergence is quite amazing, and it creates, one of the terms uses a triangulation. When you come to very similar conclusions from very different perspectives using very different kinds of data, brain data and behavioral classroom data, then you got to think, well, it's probably true. And I think the evidence that we have with English learners is probably true, that this is the general framework for thinking about teaching kids who know the language literacy and teaching kids who don't know the language literacy. It's basically the same, but they're not identical because the additional supports required by English learners. So let's turn to the money question here. How does the teaching need to be similar or different when students are learning to read in a language they're simultaneously learning? And the best clues we have are from two really effective first grade early interventions for language learners at risk for reading difficulties. Now, I want to be clear here. These are studies that were done with English learners, emergent bilinguals, choose your term, that were having difficulty getting traction, right? This was what you might call tier 2 instruction for kids needing, they're definitely not special ed, right? We're not talking about tier 3 special ed, but we're talking about more intensive instruction in order to help them kind of get over what hurdles they might have. They may have weak phonological sensitivity, or they may have weaker short-term memory. Any kind of things that would be difficulties. So these are kids who are at risk for reading difficulties. And so what happened was there are two really important studies. Don't bother reading this, is just to show you that it's actually a published article. And both of these studies, one by Sharon Vaughn and one by Linnea Airy, began with small group interventions that had been demonstrated effective for monolingual struggling readers. Same thing, kids in K1 who are having difficulty getting traction, monolingual speakers, and these interventions had been effective in helping a lot of the kids kind of catch up. And they had all the standard operating procedures, right? All the usual suspects. A direct instruction approach. The goal was fluent, meaningful reading. They included phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, word recognition, text fluency, comprehension strategies. These all should be very familiar, from the National Reading Panel. One thing that was added here, which I think is really good, is writing. One of the criticisms, as you probably know, of the National Reading Panel from over 20 years ago is they talked about reading. And, we really now think of literacy a little more expansively. Literacy is reading and writing. And we know there's a reciprocal relationship that promoting reading helps writing and promoting writing helps reading. So if nothing else, we've learned that and other things as well in the intervening 20 years. So they included the activities like writing letters, sounding out reading words, reading the codable text, using comprehension strategies. Nothing surprising here. So they took this intervention that was effective for monolingual speakers, and they added language supports for the English learners who are having difficulty, right? Exactly what the brain science would predict. And these language supports comprise between 3 and 8 activities per lesson. And these would be things like clarifying the words and content with visuals and gestures and expressions. A lot of times it's called sheltered instruction. I'm sure many of you excuse me, are familiar with the SIOP, the Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. Words and the directions were defined. You want to make sure that kids know what they're supposed to do when you tell them to trace or to copy. 2 or 3 key vocabulary words a day were highlighted and illustrated. They provided instruction in English language use with students responding. Teachers guided the students' story retelling and discussion. So there were vocabulary lessons, certainly, but there was also language in use, vocabulary in use. So the students were listening to, responding, and saying the words and the texts that were being used to teach them to read. Keep in mind what I said before, that if you're a 6-7-year-old with normal developmental processes and so forth, you know the meanings and the sounds of the words that are being used to teach you to read. You can't make that assumption for kids who are learning the language as they're learning to read. That's the main difference. So what they found, the Vaughn et al. Study, was the only one that demonstrated a statistically significant effect in reading of a group of studies of interventions with English learners. It demonstrated a significant effect on reading. Now, there was a later study by Linnea Airy that also emphasized language support and got moderate to strong effects on reading for students learning to read in English as they learn to understand and speak it. And I want to really emphasize this study. I normally don't like to put so much text all at once, but the summary, the synthesis that Linnea Airy wrote about what the purpose of their intervention was just captures something so important, so important that I want to really pause on this. So let me just read it if you'll forgive me. One purpose of the intervention was to develop oral language by encouraging students to talk about the books and by explaining the meanings of new vocabulary words. These words were written in students' personal books, and the meanings were reviewed each time the book was read. Now, pay attention. Sorry, I sound like a teacher. Students were encouraged to decode unknown words by relying on their letter sound knowledge, right? Foundational skills. Decode unknown words by relying on letter sound knowledge, and then cross-checking with meaning and pictures to confirm the identities of the words. Now, I want to pause here because a lot of times people confuse this with some version of, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of balanced literacy, balanced reading, balanced literacy, where kids are encouraged to use picture cues, to use the first letter, what would make sense there. It's not that. Because balanced literacy isn't balanced, it's random literacy. It's like a choose your own adventure as you identify words literacy, because this is very specific. The pathway to word recognition begins, let's call it the on-ramp. The on-ramp to word recognition begins by decoding unknown words by relying on letter sound knowledge. But then once you do that, you want to cross-check, you want to teach kids and practice and train, if you don't mind that particular term that some people find offensive, but show them how to cross-check with meaning and pictures to confirm the identities of the words. If you don't know the meaning of the words, even if you can tell what the pictures are, if you don't know the meanings of the words, you cannot do the cross-checking. And when you think about what you want the process of reading to be, as you teach kids early on, the kind of mental metacognitive habits you want them to get into, is your first pass at reading a word is to decode using letter sound knowledge and then saying, okay, is this a word I know? And does it make sense here? If the answer is yes, go. If the answer is no, go back and try again. Now, part of the art of teaching is knowing how to guide students in that process, knowing when to have the student try again, and knowing when, no, this student's kind of randomly, swimming around. We got to guide them more precisely. There are no precise algorithms for how to do this. I mean, the art of teaching reading will always be part of teaching reading, no matter how scientific you get. But we know from very solid research that the on-ramp is letter sound knowledge, then cross-checking with meaning and context to see if it all makes sense. That is the key to what I'm trying to communicate here, and is fully supported by classroom studies and by the neurolinguistic studies. So then after beginning and early reading, you have the same basic ideas, but language learners face additional challenges at later stages. You have the same basic idea that it's basically the same thing, learning and developing as a reader, but you need additional language support because you're learning the language as you're learning to become a better and more proficient reader. And you face, as an English learner, emergent bilingual, additional challenges. The language demands of school become exponentially more difficult, as you know. Literacy becomes increasingly dependent on higher levels of English proficiency. Knowledge of the world becomes increasingly important, but the foundations still matter. They remain important. So let me try to sum up here. English learners and English speakers, same or different? Well, foundational skills are foundational to reading, must be prioritized in beginning and early reading. Same. Foundational skills are not enough. More is needed. Language, knowledge, we can have a longer list, but that'll stand in for now. That's the same. English learners, emergent bilinguals, need English language development to understand the words they are learning to read as they use their foundational skills to read them, then confirm with meaning. Now, this is what's different. This is what is different. They have to understand the words. Teachers have to make sure they understand the words they're learning to read as they use their foundational skills to confirm meaning. That is the same, because once they understand the words, they can then use their foundational skills as the on-ramp to word recognition, then confirm with meaning. That's what all learners need to do as they're learning to read. But for the English learners, making sure they understand words that you can by and large take for granted if they're proficient English speakers at 5, 6, and 7, for English learners, that's what you have to pay very close attention to. And then later on, there's a need for ongoing academic language development. Now, that's the same. That's true for all students. But it's different for English learners because they continue, until they become fully English proficient, they continue to need support in learning usually the meanings. By the time they get into upper elementary and beyond, the sounds should be quite familiar. But the content, the semantics, the meaning, they still need additional support that English speakers don't necessarily need. And let me just wrap up with this very briefly. What does not work for English learners, emergent bilinguals? Well, a heavy diet of phonics and decoding with insufficient attention to the meanings of words and text doesn't work. Or 3Qing, as I mentioned, using a combination of letters, syntax, pictures, and context clues to recognize words. It's called balance, but as I said, I think it's actually unbalanced and random. So what does work? Well, Instead of the heavy diet with insufficient attention to meaning and of words and text, as much foundational skills instruction is needed to master the code and ample attention to words and text meanings. And instead of 3Qing, students learn to read words using decoding skills first, then confirming accuracy with meaning and context. So, in brief, those are the two main things that I want to leave you with. But then students, English learning students, also need continued English language development support beyond what is in their beginning reading texts. But as they learn to read more sophisticated texts, they need additional support to comprehend those texts. They need content and background knowledge, just as all of our students do. They need to build on their assets. Students have assets. All students have assets. We tend to think too often a sort of a deficit mentality, which doesn't really serve anyone's purpose, because it's to your advantage as a teacher and the student's advantage to recognize, identify, and build on their assets. And then, of course, you want to have relevant and motivating learning experiences for the students. So very finally, I want to just emphasize that the methods and findings we have from reading research are relevant for helping improve language learners' reading development. They're also relevant for helping answer ongoing questions to improve student learning, all students. But we also have to draw on informed and effective classroom practice. I might be an outlier among researchers. I don't think so, because I think knowledgeable researchers understand that reading research is not going to answer all of our questions, but they certainly provide a set of invaluable tools, and we ignore them at our, and most importantly, at our students' risk. So I hope some of this has given you some things to think about. Here are the references that you find at the end of the PowerPoint, and I'll now give you the obligatory multilingual thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid we're way over. I am so sorry. I feel like I completely went way over. I'm sorry about that.
Claude, I think they loved it. They feel, I mean, I learned a lot when I was listening to you about this really is based in brain scans. This really is based in amazing research. And what are we giving kids to think about that decoding, right? That practice is what I heard you say. Don't go too much, but they do need that practice and decoding and allowing them to think about that.
Okay. Well, good. I'm glad that came through.
So I want to kind of go through and talk about a little bit of how we thought so much about English language learners as we thought about it, Claude. And kind of when we think about our decodables, we were very intentional to make sure they were something really good for English language learners to support. So I just want to highlight, you didn't talk a little bit about this tons, but I think the importance for English language learners of seeing themselves in books. And that could have been at the end when you were talking about motivation, right? That provides for them some motivation to see themselves and hear their own stories and be resonated in who they are as people. So all of our books, we've tried to tell the real stories of kids' lives, those mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors into who they are. And I think the more that really matters to families and kids. So we feel lucky to be able to do that for English language learners. And I think something I also heard you talk about a little bit was the more explicit we are in our phonics. They really need some explicit instruction and to be clear about that. So for us, all of our decodables start with going over kind of what the decodable is really about, so that parents know, families know, teachers know, everyone knows how to support kids when they're doing that instruction, especially for English language learners. And one of the most important things that I think we've thought about for English language learners is that video. I heard you talk about like really giving them some extra support around that. So every one of our decodables comes with a QR code that links to a phonics video, both in Spanish and English. The idea of us putting it in Spanish was that families could then support their kids in their own, and because every family wants to know how to support their children in around that. And I think you had some parts where I will remember listening about family support, really engaging families, how important that is for English language learners. And then for us, we've just come out with our Spanish books, and we're really excited about that because I heard you talk about for English language learners, not everyone gets to learn in their home language, but the power of that to build off for literacy both in Spanish and English is really important and good. So we've started creating the product that we have that no one else has, are take home decodable packs, with the idea that we'll take their reading information and reading data from districts and then make sure that kids are getting the exact phonics skills that they need, with 10 decodables raced around their own phonics skills. And we have up to 11 rounds of these. I heard you talk about the science of learning, how kids need repetition around that. And so all of our decodables on the very back have a research-based reading activity. We call it our high five reading, encouraging kids to read and reread their phonics. And I heard you also talk about that reading and writing connection. Um, Sometimes it's not rocket science, right? But that reading writing connection gets us there, right? It's not too complicated. Just have kids read and write. So for us, we added in a page both in our Spanish books and our English books for our take homes to get kids to be able to practice that writing and of a word around that phonics skill. And of course, our video phonics lessons are in everything, but we actually, for our take homes, move the phonics lessons to the front of the book just to put it front and like front and center. Um, and then I also heard you talking about small group instruction and how powerful that is for English language learners. So we now tell every teacher who gets our take home decodables which kids are getting which book so she can start doing some small group instruction, knowing how powerful that is. Um, and what I just want to talk about is how people around the country are using our take home decodable packs. I saw Manu from Portola Valley was on the call, and they bought summer packs for all of their English language learners, one for each round, one for each week of summer school, plus one to go home. Hillsborough in Florida also bought summer packs for their kids. They also bought them in Spanish for their English language learners and their multilingual, bilingual classrooms. And then we also have been working with lots of districts for our take home packs throughout the year. It's an extra added support for English language learners and we love working in Title I schools. A lot of times districts buy those phonics packs throughout the year for their Title I schools. And then school break packs are really nice for English language learners. They get it the week before break, the week of break, the week after break. And now we have our back to school review packs. So our back to school review packs are one pack before school starts of like you're in first grade, you get the skills of kindergarten to come back and start the year off just on the right note and just be ready for it, right? Here you go. Here's a review pack of all the kinder skills. We have all of these in Spanish and English. And then something beautiful that some of our districts are starting to do are English language learner student packs. They're buying it both in Spanish and English for families. I don't think you jumped in, Claude, about building that like background knowledge for kids that even if they're learning in English. But I think it's like always helpful for English language learners to validate their home language and support that. So even some districts like Cincinnati doesn't have as many bilingual classrooms, but for all of their English language learners, they sent books home in Spanish, just knowing that families could start working with their kids in Spanish, lose their home language, and start reading to them. And then we have lesson plans for everyone in Spanish and English for all of our books because I heard you also say that this should be simple. Like this, in some ways, this isn't rocket science, right? We want really good lesson plans that allow kids and teachers to partner in small groups. So for our take homes, kids get a caregiver guide. Families get a caregiver guide. We have a take home quick start guide to make it really easy. And um, something that I just want to talk about that we didn't go deep into, but for our English language learners and for the kids in third to fifth grade who are still kind of just stuck on their reading and kind of getting over that hump, it's a lot of multisyllabic reading. So we created what we're calling high interest chapter decodable books to help kids get over that syllabic kind of hump and really practice their syllables. And I heard you, Con, talk about like motivation. So for these books, we're really thinking hard of their nonfiction, their mysteries to create that motivation for kids to want to if you're a third to fifth grade emerging reader. And our pre-emergent library is really beautiful with the idea that these have 3 videos to them, one for letter, one for sound, and one for letter formation. So we just feel really lucky to create a product that feels good for kids everywhere, validates them, And we're so excited to have our Spanish books coming out. So if anyone around the country is looking for Spanish books, I was a dual immersion principal myself and could never find Spanish books to buy for my teachers. And as soon as we were ready, it was a real passion project for us to make sure that we had some books in Spanish for families and kids in those bilingual classrooms. So there you go, Claude. It's so exciting. I feel like what you're doing and the work that you're doing and the research, and we just feel really proud we got to share it with people all around the country. So it's the start of school. So I see people are hopping off because they've probably got to go back and like launch their classrooms. I'm guessing, Claude, what do you think?
I think you're probably right, Sarah. Yeah, it's great that they
um,
joined you for as long as they did because I know schools are cranking up now, and it's always a crazy time.
Claude,
Okay,
thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for joining us. And we can't wait for our next webinar. Thanks, Claude.
thanks very much. Bye.